week. Shaky ceasefires and clashes in Sudan, citizens fleeing the capital Khartoum, peace talks ongoing in Saudi Arabia. Our reporters discuss the latest developments and impact of Sudan's violent conflict. Also, the story of Africa's footballer president. Journalist Robney Sieh talks to me about his new book that examines the popularity, the politics and the presidency of Liberia's leader, George Weah. Straight Talk Africa starts now. And we're coming to you from VOA's headquarters in Washington. Hello and a warm welcome to Straight Talk Africa. I'm Haydé Adams. We have a great show lined up for you, and we do begin with the latest developments in the deadly conflict that is engulfing Sudan. As we speak, mediation talks brokered by the United States are underway in Saudi Arabia. Now, the negotiations between the generals of the warring factions, the Sudanese army and the paramilitary group Rapid Support Forces, come as clashes continue in the capital Khartoum, and tens of thousands of Sudanese attempt to flee the country. Now, there is no word yet on whether these talks in Jeddah are actually making progress. Will any deal between the two sides lead to long-term peace and any kind of stability in Sudan? Let's discuss this. And that takes us now to our reporter segment. And with me here in studio is Nabil Biagio from VOA's English to African News Service. And joining us via Skype from Springfield, Virginia is Akmal Abdallah. He's a journalist with Radio Sawa, Sudan, at the Middle East Broadcasting Networks, which is VOA's sister network in the U.S. Agency for Global Media. Nabil and Akmal, a warm welcome to you both. And Akmal, I'm going to start with you. We see that there are these mediation talks in Jeddah. What are these talks meant to accomplish? I mean, what are the mediators hoping to achieve here?
Thank you for having me, and thank you for your guest, and hello for your guest also, and your audience. Actually, these talks in Jeddah, it's who they are gathering in Jeddah. They are seeking about the ceasefire, short ceasefire. Now, the first thing they are looking for, it's as short term, because you know what? In spite of anything, now there is no progress on the ground. There is fighting in different areas in Khartoum North, and also in Darfur, also in Omdurman, and now in Jeddah, they are looking for to take the very, very short ceasefire to go a little bit on this negotiation.
Nabil, a very, very short ceasefire. I mean, what does that actually help or accomplish? And I mean, how do you make the connection between that and the possibility of any stability or long-term peace?
That seems to be far away right now. Like Akmal rightfully said, they're looking to establish only a truce, only a short-term ceasefire, which why they only invited the warring parties, people who are shooting, to come around the negotiating table and silence their guns. As we speak, there is no space for civilians or even humanitarians to participate in those talks, although they say they're aiming for a humanitarian truce or humanitarian ceasefire. The head of the United Nations mission to Sudan, Volker Perthes himself, is in Port Sudan. He's left behind in Sudan, and the warring parties sent only their representatives to hammer out a short-term truce. And even that seems to be difficult. Today is the 5th day of the talks. They started on Saturday. And diplomats in Saudi Arabia are saying the two sides, they still seem to believe they can win this militarily, because they're both on their maximalist demands. They're unwilling to make compromises. So no progress at all has been reported so far.
Akmal, we hear reports of, shaky ceasefires for weeks and days now, clashes continuing inside the country. What are you hearing about what is going on inside the country? And here I'm talking about the humanitarian side of things. What do people who are still in Sudan have to experience and face on a daily basis?
I want to add, as for what Nabil said, that people, they said this, who are in Jeddah now, they have no full authority to take more decisions or to take more authorized, or they have no power to take decisions for what they are want exactly. As for your question, today our reporter in North Khartoum said that from the morning there is a lot of fighting in Khartoum North between the army and the rebel, and this is used by flights, and also every one of the two sides, they want to take more places. I think it goes through the negotiation in Jeddah to make more positive sides, and also to make progress in the negotiation in Jeddah.
Yes, just to add quickly to that, let's not forget that Saudi Arabia and the United States brokered a 72-hour ceasefire before weeks back, and which was extended and then extended again and then extended again. And none of the ceasefires have been respected. And from what we have seen on the ground and from other conflicts in the region that we have covered, when negotiations are going on, usually this is when the battle is fiercest.
Why is that?
The warring parties hope that winnings on the battlefield would strengthen their hands at the negotiating table and would allow them to dictate impose terms on their opponents.
And Nabil, what are ordinary people supposed to do right now? We're talking about a very short-term ceasefire. These are very sort of meal peace, goals here. But what are people supposed to do except try to leave the country? How big is this exodus from Sudan right now?
The United Nations reported yesterday, the Organization for Migration, International Organization for Migration, that 700,000 people have been forcibly displaced within Sudan. A lot of them in Khartoum, of course, a big city of millions. These are internally displaced people. 150,000 people have been forced to flee Sudan altogether to neighbor. Most of them, or half of them, poured into Egypt. Egypt took in 70,000 refugees from Sudan. Chad also took about a third of that number. And South Sudan took also more than 30,000 refugees. Ethiopia took also its share. So the humanitarian situation is really dire, and people are focusing on fleeing or just staying safe, moving from one place to another inside Khartoum, or trying to make it across the border. And it's not just a humanitarian crisis in Sudan. Now the spillage, the exodus, has caused humanitarian crisis in neighboring countries. Chad is now swamped. There are reports of fears of starvation in Chad because the influx is just huge. South Sudanese officials and aid officials in South Sudan are already overwhelmed. Both government officials and aid officials have made statements. People, even in the capital, Juba, have reported price hikes and shortages in foods and other commodities, because South Sudan relies a lot on Sudan to get certain goods and commodities. So it's really, it's regional at this point. It's not just limited to Sudan or Khartoum.
And to that point, Akmal, this conflict, as Nabil said, is beginning to affect neighboring countries. Egypt already hosting thousands of Sudanese fleeing the conflict, along with, as Nabil said, Chad, South Sudan, Ethiopia. But when it comes to Egypt, which has a special relationship with Sudan in terms of where the connection people feel there with one another, does Egypt see the influx of Sudanese necessarily as a threat to its own stability at this point?
So far, the Sudanese displaced to Egypt, until yesterday, they 6,700 until now. And this amount, it's a big amount in Egypt. If we take in our consideration the economy issues now in Egypt, the pound, the Egyptian pound, it's down and also there is a lot of difficulties in the Egyptian itself. So the government welcomed the Sudanese, which they came there, but also they asking for the global organization to help them, and people, they said there is a lot of difficulties in Egypt, from looking for houses, looking for foods, and also looking for shelters. You know, they are lefting everything. They are left everything behind them in Sudan and going only with a lot small things in their hands.
Yes. Nabil, I'm sure there's a generation of Sudanese who never thought that they would find themselves in this position. I don't think anyone who gets caught in a situation like this can believe it straight out that what is happening. And of course, Sudan does straddle this world of sub-Saharan Africa and the Arab world. You spoke earlier about South Sudan and Chad. What is at stake for those countries? Those are countries that already have challenges of their own. How does a prolonged conflict affect them?
South Sudan has a lot to lose. There are already very serious fears that the pipeline, the oil pipeline, which is the lifeline of the South Sudanese economy, could be affected or disturbed by the fighting. That would be the biggest nightmare for South Sudan. But even without that happening, right now, as we speak, oil production in South Sudan is affected because they get supplies, materials, and other technical assistance from Sudan. That's been affected. Commodities that used to flow into South Sudan from Sudan have been halted because the border is not safe anymore. And you could see it from the level of diplomacy that's going on in the region. For example, the Egyptian Foreign Affairs Minister yesterday, he was in Chad and then he went to South Sudan. And today we're reporting that the security advisor for the South Sudanese president is in Egypt, meeting President Abdel Fattah to discuss the crisis in Sudan and its spillage, its ramifications for neighboring countries like South Sudan, like Chad, like Egypt.
Wow, and we will, of course, here at USAGM continue our reporting on this very important story. You can watch out for and listen out for Nabil Biagio's reporting on South Sudan in Focus, as well as Akmal Abdallah's reporting on Radio Sawa. Gentlemen, thank you so much. Nabil and Akmal, thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, after the break, the story of Africa's footballer president. Liberian journalist Robney Sieh sits down with me to discuss his new book about Liberia's President George Weah. You do not want to miss this. Stay with us.
In times of change, when the world seems uncertain and what we hear doesn't reflect what we see, we seek the truth. When we are told only part of the story, we lose trust. In moments of crisis, our dreams, hopes, and wishes for a better tomorrow depends on a free press. At Voice of America, we bring you the stories that people take risks to see. We connect the world and unite it with truth. At Voice of America, we show you the whole picture.
around the world. Let's go.
You're with Straight Talk Africa. Welcome back. Liberian journalist Robney Sieh was once sentenced to 5,000 years in jail for failing to pay $1.6 million in a libel case. In 2013, he was sued by a minister for reporting on government corruption. Sieh was released after 4 months in prison. Now he's written a book about Liberian President George Weah, an international football star who came to power in 2018. Sieh's book about the man he calls Africa's footballer president is an unofficial biography. It details the complexity of Weah's personality, politics, and presidency. Sieh sat down with me here in Washington recently to discuss the book. Rodney, what motivated you to write a book about a president who was famous even before he became president? I mean, what story did you hope to tell, and who did you speak to for insights about President George Weah?
So the process began in a way where I wanted to make sure that he was involved in the process, because I wanted this book, if I do it, I wanted it to be great. And so I contacted him. I sent him a text message on WhatsApp and said, I need to tell you a story. Are you open to it? And he said, oh, I'm not ready to tell my story. And so I didn't give up. And I was very precise about who I spoke to about this book. I didn't want to tell the story that was hearsay, I wanted people who I interviewed to be on the record. Some people agreed, but they wanted to be off the record. And I was reluctant because I'm a very controversial journalist. I've been to prison twice. And I wanted to make sure that when I tell the story, it's a story that will hit home to people. And everyone I interviewed for this book are people who wanted to talk about it. The current vice president, Winston Tubman, who was George Weah as a running mate to him in 2011 elections. And so I talked to former footballers who played with him, friends. I went to Cameroon, I went to Europe, talked to people who knew him. And I just really wanted to tell a story that will resonate with people. And it's not often we see a former athlete, a former footballer become a president. And I thought the story was intriguing. I thought it was inspirational to a sense. Where it gets tricky is the part of the politics and the presidency. Before he even made up his mind to run for president, there was issues about his unpreparedness for the job and his lack of education. So those things intrigue me. And I wanted this story to be about that, the transition from the footballer to the president. And this is where we are.
Now, of course, you mentioned some of the things that you had to go through in order to get this book written. But what was the main challenge for you as a journalist and as an author to write a book about him without him?
And this was perhaps one of my greatest challenges in my life as a writer, as a journalist. You know, in Africa, it's very unheard of for people to agree to be interviewed about a sitting president. And so there lies my challenge.
Well, this was a gutsy move on your part.
So people are really brave to talk. Some people are really brave to talk. And that's why it's unofficial, because he didn't agree to do the interview. And so I had to find ways to tell the story about this person from where he began. And there I found an old man called Old Man Yaya Kamara. He was someone who actually held George Weah's hand and took him to the first team he played for, Invincible 11, and told the coaches, this is my son. I want him to play on this team. And that's how he began the process of transforming into George Weah. And the old man didn't stop there. He went to next door Guinea, where he found a coach who was out of job called Fernando Sitoli. Sitoli came down to George Weah and said, look, you have the potential to be a Roger Milla or Diego Maradona. And those are the top players of those days. Right. And he said, if you put your mind to it, you can make it. So the book starts from that era where George is struggling to find himself. He had his talent, he was gutsy, he was feared by his opponents in the local domestic leagues, but he wasn't there yet. And so the process of him training, I think is what made him the footballer he was.
I already see a lot of political metaphors coming out of the sports side of things. But Rodney, you said that you covered him during his years as a soccer player, right, as a football player. What did this book and the research that you did, the interviews you did, what did all those experiences reveal to you about him? Something you didn't know that was very striking, and perhaps that ordinary people don't know about him.
George Weah is probably, let me say, one of the greatest footballer to not go to the World Cup. And Liberia had the opportunity to go to the World Cup in 94, but they were going through civil crisis and stuff like that. And if we had just won a game against Ghana, we would have qualified. But we lost that game. And George actually almost retired from the game because he felt he was insulted. People say he sold the game to Ghana. People say he didn't play his best game. And he retired from international football after that. Although he came back, it showed that there were lots of tension in the background of the team. And most of the players felt that he held grudges against them. He played people who he wanted to play. He played his friends who he had more connection with, and others who didn't have connection with him, he didn't play them. Because he was George Weah, he was like a coach, and he could decide who played on the field. So the book goes into all of those behind the scenes things that happened. I mean, I interviewed his people who were there, so it's very gripping. And the way I wrote this book is like a movie. It's like I wanted people to leave this book saying, I've now understand why George Weah is who he is as president, because of what he was as a footballer. And there were the similar things you're saying as a president, these things were seen those days when he was a great football player.
This is fascinating, but also timely, Rodney, because Liberia will hold elections later this year. Of course, President Weah said that he will run for a second term, but his first term has been dogged by corruption and, of course, involving even people in his own circle, his government officials, his chief of staff. But then there's also the economic downturn. We know, as you said, that he was a great football player, and some would say that football is a contact sport, right? And so is politics often, right? What kind of president has he been?
Well, as you know, George Weah succeeded Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and those are tough shoes to fill. Ironically, Ellen Sirleaf endorsed him for president without endorsing a vice president, Joseph Boyka, who's currently running for president now. It tells you that she felt comfortable with George Weah. Most people criticize her for that because they're saying everything that's happening now in Liberia is because of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, because she endorsed George Weah's candidacy and she ensured that he became president. As a result, what we're seeing now is a lack of governance, a lot of corruption, greed by officials in government. And President Weah has been very defensive of those who were accused of corruption. Late last year, the U.S. placed sanctions on 3 of his officials to send a message that they're not happy with what's going on. And we're hearing there are more sanctions on the way. So all of these things puts it in a different dilemma for him. There have been protests when he first took over. And so all of these things, these entanglements, these different variations of things that happen in the country, is because people are not happy.
How many of these qualities that he had as a sportsman have sort of spilled over into politics? Do you see some of those characteristics of George Weah, the footballer, come through in George Weah, the president?
So people always ask me why I picked the title, the footballer president. And sometime last year, he made a speech at a dedication ceremony where he apologized to the Liberian people because he's lost football too much. His presidency has been buoyed by a lot of comparison to football. He's always playing football. If he's not playing football, he's singing reggae music. So people are like, there's all these things happening in the country. People can send their kids to school. People can feed their kids. There's corruption, there's greed, and you're playing football. And he said, I can't help it. This is who I am. This is the man who came from the slums of Gibraltar, where he grew up, from West Point, from Claratown, from Newtown. Those are places that in the process of writing this book, I went to those places. I interviewed people about what they thought about him as president. And many of them were glorified that he was president because he's one of them. The irony is that they're not seeing the results of that love. The love has not been reciprocated because they still live in poverty.
Right.
Most of the conditions that were there when he lived there, when he grew up there, are still there. George Weah is a very lovable guy. With all the things that happen in the country, this should be a slam dunk for the opposition. But because he's George Weah, he's still massively popular among his base.
Right.
So it's tricky. How do you explain to people Liberia's going through this mess, but he may get reelected? So that's the dilemma Liberia finds itself in.
And speaking of that, Rodney, should President Weah be re-elected, what do you think is the one thing that he will need to accomplish for Liberia, for his presidency to have been a success? I mean, what's the one thing that could make or break his legacy?
If he fails to tackle corruption, as he did not do in the first term, if he fails to improve governance, as he did not do in the first term, if he fails to address the issue of poverty, if you drive to Liberia streets nowadays, Monrovia streets, there are young kids who should be in school selling on the street between cars. Those kids should be in school. Women are being raped. Young girls are having fistula because they're being raped and born in children under 12, 11 years old. And this is something that I'm very passionate about in terms of addressing these issues. And so I think if he revisit where he came from, because he's popular, it's like an empire without clothes. You want to hear the things that people tell you around you, but outside that space is where the problem lies. If he can move beyond appointing only his friends in government, people that he knows, and go outside the box to opposition and bring in some people to help him, he could be a very different person the second time if he gets it. The biggest gift Madam Sirleaf had, as the former president had, was she was able to bring opposition figures in the government. The government was kind of inclusive from different parts of the country. George Weah needs to really look at himself, not just where he's from, but outside where he's from, and bring people in, new breed, new blood. If he sticks with the same people, I'm afraid it will be a doomed legacy.
Here's hoping. I'll keep my fingers crossed that your book becomes a movie. Tell me when and if it does. But Robney Sieh, what a pleasure to have had you here on the show. Thank you so much for coming in to talk to us. The title of the book is George Weah, The Story of Africa's Footballer President. Rodney, thank you for your time.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
What an interesting interview there. That is our show this week. Be sure to follow us on social media. Thank you so much for being with us. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.